Let's take a look at this fascinating game by Garry Kasparov against Jan Timman back in 1991. The game starts with d4, d5, c4, c6. So we have a Slav defense, knight c3, knight f6, e3, and g6. Not the most common setup here, but black is looking to fianchetto his kingside bishop. Knight f3, bishop g7, bishop e2, castles, castles. So some fairly uneventful operations in the opening, both sides just quietly developing their pieces. Black plays e6, so going for a bit of a Swiss cheese setup here with his pawns all being on light squares except for this guy here on a7. We have b4 taking more space on the queen side, knight d7 developing, and bishop b2, getting that bishop on a nice long diagonal in case of any action in the center. Black takes on c4 and we simply recapture with our bishop. b6, black's looking to fianchetto his bishop as well. a4, taking more space on the queen side. Bishop b7, and black is just about finished development here. And bishop a3, so moving a piece that was already developed in the opening. In these types of structures, black would really like to play c5 and free his position. With c5 open, his bishop opens up and he just gets a lot more scope for his pieces. Placing our dark bishop on a3 puts the brakes on that plan for black. We have rook c8, further preparing for that potential break of c5, and rook b1 from white. So his idea here is that in case black were to push forward with c5 immediately, black wouldn't be able to recapture because that would open up the file and expose his hanging bishop on b7. So black instead develops his rook to e8, also stepping out of that x-ray from the bishop on a3. So queen e2 here from white. We are looking at some of these light squares in black's camp and also preparing for some further expansion. Black advances his knight into the center of the board and hits white's loose knight on c3. White exchanges and black recaptures with the c-pawn. White steps forward to b5 and pins the knight against the rook. Black steps out of the pin, and a5 here from Garry, pushing forward to break up this structure on the queen side. Now, it might look like black can just win a pawn here, right? His queen is x-raying a5. Can't black just take this pawn? No, he can't, because we have a hanging rook here on e7. So, always got to be paying attention to those x-rays. Black simply steps his rook up to c7, with some ideas of potentially doubling up by bringing his queen back here. Garry brings his last piece into the game, rook to c1, and knight to d7 here from black. So his idea is that he'd like to start advancing his queenside pawns and pushing white's pieces back. But white is too fast for that. He advances to a6 himself, forcing the black bishop back to c8. Garry retreats his bishop, freeing up the b5 square to play b5 and solidify that structure with the pawn, also opening up the bishop's scope as well. We have an exchange of rooks, and black takes the c-file. Kasparov reinforces his queenside structure and opens up the scope of his bishop, and we have the final set of rooks traded off. Black moves his queen to c7, hitting the loose bishop on c1 and taking control of the open file. So things are starting to look more manageable for black, right? He is very short on space, as we can see on the queen side. His position is quite cramped, but over the past handful of moves he has managed to exchange a number of pieces off. And when you are short on space and have a cramped position, exchanging pieces is always a good idea. So it looks like black is starting to make some real meaningful progress here. Garry simply moves his bishop that was under attack, and black advances with f5, taking control of some light squares, with the idea of rerouting his knight into an aggressive outpost. White drops his queen back, looking to start infiltrating on the dark squares, and black looks to activate his knight. White improves his bishop, placing it on a more active diagonal where it has influence within Black's camp. And Black looks to neutralize that, making sure that the bishop does not infiltrate into the position. H4, simply gaining some space on the king side and also providing some luft for the king in the future if needed. Knight f6, so we are starting to eye off some nice juicy light squares in White's camp. And Kasparov leaps into e5 with his own knight, a glorious outpost here. During the opening of the game, when I spoke about the Swiss cheese setup that Black had, we talked about the potential weaknesses that come along with that approach. It's not just that we are opening up some dark squares around the king, but we have created a permanent weakness, a hole in our position, e5 here, which can never be challenged by a pawn. It can only be challenged by pieces. So that is what Black does. He drops his knight back to d7, challenging that incredibly strong knight. And we see a quick repetition of moves as the players were getting closer to time control. But Gary was not looking for a draw here. He had a much more sinister plan in mind. He leaps into c6, putting a huge thorn in Black's position here, absolutely completely cramping the position. From a positional standpoint, this knight is an absolute monster and a wedge in Black's position. But let's see what Gary has in mind to follow this up. And bishop a6 from Black. A very creative tactical idea here from Black. His idea is that if we retake the bishop, that leaves the knight unprotected here, so the Black queen would be able to simply recapture. So what did Gary miss? Did Gary just drop a pawn here? Bishop a6, was that a brilliant tactic by Black? Did Gary just oversee this completely and drop a pawn? Absolutely not. Queen to c1. This was Gary's trap that he set out. It is an absolutely brilliant move. We are lined up against Black's queen, which is loose and unprotected at the moment. We have an enormous threat in this position. We are looking to simply move our knight out of the way with check and to pick up the queen on c7. This is a huge threat. Black has to do something about it. He can't allow the knight to check the king, leaving the queen undefended. But the real issue here is that Black needs to spend the tempo to save his queen, and his bishop is also under attack as well, right? That's the real key issue now. And in chess, double attacks are the absolute bedrock of tactics. We have one threat here with a potential discovered check winning the queen, and we also have one threat here looking to pick up the bishop. So we have a classic double attack here, and in this position, Black actually resigned the game because there is nothing that can be done. Let's say, for example, he moves his king out of the way to prevent a check. We don't then pick up the bishop immediately on a6, because Black would be able to take our bishop on b4, and notice that we can't recapture because our queen is hanging on c1, right? So instead of taking on a6, we first take the bishop on f8, and then after Black recaptures, we simply take on a6, and we are now a piece up. We have got two pieces as white against just the one for Black. So absolutely nothing can be done here, and Black resigned. Let's go back to this key position here, because it was in this position that Gary cooked up this really cunning trap. He knew that jumping into c6 here would tempt a strong player into playing bishop to a6. It is an incredibly tempting move here because it looks like you just win a pawn. If Black were to go down this variation, Black's position is incredible. He's going to advance with his knight on a strong outpost, and his game is just fantastic. He knew that it would be almost impossible for someone to turn down that offer, but he had this incredible queen c1 resource as a part of his trap, simply winning the game on the spot. So there we have it, a fantastic little game by Gary, completely suffocating black in the Slav defense and finishing it off with an incredible tactic, a very cunning trap.